I think we can start now, Tabe. Over to you.
You can start now?
Yes. I think it's okay. Go ahead. Good luck.
Good afternoon. My name is Tabu Nguma from UNESCO Paris, and I would like to welcome all of you to this 9th edition of the UNESCO webinar series entitled Inclusion in the Time of COVID-19. This webinar series aims to exchange experiences and expertise on the measure to address the COVID-19 crisis at the global and local levels. The focus will be on the social dimension of leaving no one behind and on action taken to fight against the growing incidence of racism and discrimination. This edition will focus on the topic of confronting slavery's legacy of racism together. Actually, the transatlantic slave trade is considered as one of the major crimes against humanity that the world has ever seen. But it's just not the past, it's also the present, as we are still living today with many of its consequences and legacy. The COVID-19 pandemic is clearly exposing some of those legacies, including structural racism, social and economic inequality, and health vulnerability of people of African descent across the globe. This discussion is being organized by UNESCO and the United Nations Remember Slavery Program in the context of the International Decade of People of African Descent, but also under the umbrella of the UNESCO Slavery Project, whose main objectives are to break the silence on this tragedy, still largely silent, and to highlight the global transformation and cultural interaction resulting from these forced encounters. I also would like to inform you that a similar webinar will be organized on the 24th of June, addressing more specifically the issue of the articulation between structural racism and health and what the current pandemic revealed from this insidious relation. Now I would like to give the floor to our moderator, Mr. Brandon Verma, manager of the Remember Slavery Program at the United Nations.
Thank you so much, Tabwe. It's a great thrill for us from the United Nations Remember Slavery Program to be with our UNESCO colleagues in Paris to bring you this webinar today. And Tabwe actually made a lot of the points that I was going to make, so I can go right into the substance of our webinar today. Today, you will be hearing from experts who will explain why an understanding of the transatlantic slave trade and its legacy of racism is necessary to move forward during this time of COVID-19, and how the next steps in reopening our economies present an opportunity for transformational change. We hope that you'll post on social media about today's event, and if you do, please use the following hashtags: Remember Slavery, African Descent, and Fight Racism. Now, before we get to our panel of experts, I'd like to turn over the floor to Maher Nasser, who is the Director of the Outreach Division of the United Nations Department of Global Communications. He will deliver brief opening remarks from New York. Maher, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brendan, and thank you, Tabwe, and happy to be part of this event in which we are, of course, partnering with our sister agency, UNESCO. As COVID-19 wreaks havoc around the world, its impact on people's lives has touched everyone, no matter where you live or work, or currently, of course, not work. However, that impact is not always the same. Sheltering in a well-serviced home with access to delivery services is not the same as being homeless or living in crowded conditions in a poor neighborhood. A particular case of this inequality is how the virus is impacting communities in what we have seen recently in the media about higher death tolls in Black communities in several countries around the world. And that is not a coincidence. The situation facing people of African descent during the time of COVID-19 warrants attention and a discussion. Can the case be made that this is linked to the history of legacy of the transatlantic slave trade? I think this webinar will consider this and more. Our department, the UN Department of Global Communications, manages the UN Remember Slavery program, which works to educate the public about slavery and its shameful legacy of racism, which we still see today. And I think we all see the headlines from Minneapolis and what happened on Monday, the killing of George Floyd, a Black American who died shouting, "I can't breathe," when a white police officer had his knee on his neck. I think that maybe also speaks volumes to what we are talking about. The transatlantic slavery trade was justified through propaganda that portrayed Africans as being less than human. It shaped our modern conception of race. It gave us social constructs and structural racism that we still live with 600 years later. It led to policies and beliefs that have kept many people of African descent from advancing towards prosperity. And it is in this context that the United Nations proclaimed the International Decade for People of African Descent to be observed from 2015 to 2024. The decade works to promote recognition, justice, development, and protection of human rights for Afro-descendants. Now we come to COVID-19. This is probably the biggest crisis the world has seen since the Second World War, if not even more. It has exposed vulnerabilities also of the most marginalized and people on the sidelines who have suffered from poverty and marginalization for long before COVID arrived. And that affects people of African descent around the world. Disproportionate numbers of people of African descent work in the service industries. Many serve as health aides and delivery personnel, and their services are considered to be essential, and yet many work without protective equipment. Disproportionate numbers also live in densely populated communities and have unequal access to food, water, and secure housing. They're also disproportionately crowded into jails, prisons, and camps for refugees and internally displaced persons. That is an alarming fact, given the highly contagious aspect of COVID-19. Meanwhile, common pre-existing conditions, including cardiovascular disease, racism-related hypertension, are also hampering Black communities' abilities to cope with the pandemic. During these times, I think this is the fact that when we look at a situation where the entire humanity is being faced with this deadly virus, this is the time to come together in solidarity. And the United Nations Secretary General has outlined three steps for dealing with the virus. One is, of course, dealing with the health impact. The second is dealing with the socioeconomic effects. And the third is thinking about recovery and planning for that already from now. As we plan for recovery, we have to build back better. And that doesn't only apply to green economy and renewable energy, but also it applies to addressing the inequalities that exist and that are afflicting communities and making some suffer more than others when a crisis like COVID-19 hits us. So to do that, we need also to dismantle racist structures and reform racist institutions. And with that, let's confront slavery's legacy together. thank you all for being with us. And I now hand the floor back to our moderator, to Brendan. Brendan, please. Okay.
Thank you so much, Maher, for those remarks. And you've clearly demonstrated the links between the transatlantic slave trade, racism, and what we're seeing with the COVID-19 pandemic and its effects on people of African descent. And you've shown that it's not a coincidence or an accident that we're seeing the trends that we're seeing. It's all based on history. So thank you, Maher. Our first expert speaker now is going to be Elisa Coleman. Dr. Coleman is the Senior Vice President for Global Inclusion, Diversity, and Strategic Innovation at New York University in New York. After Dr. Coleman's presentation, or during Dr. Coleman's presentation, you will be able to ask questions. Just type them in the Q&A box on your screen, and I'll select some to read out, and then Dr. Coleman will answer those. So without further ado, over to you, Dr. Coleman.
Just sorry, my mute button was still on. Apologies. Good morning, everyone, or good evening, wherever you are. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to UNESCO and the United Nations. I appreciate this opportunity to speak with you. As Brendan said, I'm Elisa Coleman, and I work at New York University. I'm not going to talk about that so much. I'm going to get right into the presentation. Can everyone see my slides?
Yes.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about this, about confronting slavery. First, of course, I want to start and make sure that everyone is just taking good care during these times. As Maher Nasser just said, we're seeing disproportionate impact on communities. So let's just make sure that everyone is availing themselves of the resources and what is available out there. And remember to, let's remember to thank all of those who've contributed to our ability to be wherever we are. For those of us who are able to shelter in place, we're doing that, quite frankly, on the backs of others. The transatlantic slave trade, as was mentioned, and I'm going to go through this relatively quickly, obviously, as was said earlier, one of the greatest crimes against humanity. If we think about the transatlantic slave trade, many people trace this somewhere between 1451 and 1875, depending on the scholar in question. When people are referring to the transatlantic slave trade, they're mostly referring to the evolution of the slave trade from West Africa and some parts, of course, from Madagascar and Mozambique, and then moving over to the Americas, including South America, the West Indies, or the Caribbean, as we call Central America, and the United States. And that is the primary focus of what I'll be talking about today. However, I did want to mention, of course, on the other side of the ocean, in the Indian Ocean, of course, there was also slave trade, and that sometimes is discounted. But for those of us who spend time in the Middle East, etc., we're very well aware of that other part of the trade industry that took place. The triangulation of the trade system was very much, so depending on who estimates the numbers, we're looking at somewhere between 12, and then some people go all the way up to 28 million. The general estimate is about 15 to 17 million, and you can see the breakdown of where slaves went. Of course, the slave trade included people, which were slaves, but also goods, and of course, slaves were considered goods. Other goods as cotton, tobacco, sugar, molasses, etc. And then, of course, this is just demonstrates that depending on where you were, this is very important to how the slave trade was operationalized, because depending on where you were, that made a difference in then how slaves were brought to different parts of the world. So particular agricultural economies, whether that was sugar or coffee, then there was different slaves with different skills from different locations would be imported to those places to supply labor. And this was really about the demand of labor. If we mentioned, and someone already mentioned this about Reconstruction, World War I, World War II, civil rights. So if we look at the import of the legacies of slavery, we move into the United States into a period of Reconstruction, which is really usually cited from 1865 to about 1900 or 1903, depending on the scholar. And then World War I, World War II, and then of course, civil rights in the 1950s, end of 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. When we think about the movement here, I want to focus on labor again, because during the Reconstruction period, this is when Black codes, which are the precursor to the Jim Crow and legal segregation, is put into place. And this is really in the United States to contain and constrain labor, the labor market, and the labor economy of Blacks post-slavery. So Black codes were codes that were literally put into place to say certain people could work in certain places and or not. And of course, many are familiar with Jim Crow, legal segregation, and the images of colored here, Black here, whites only, etc., that then ensues through the civil rights era. The reason I bring up World War I and World War II is because what we see is the disproportionate, right, impact. So when particularly Black men would go off and fight to war at war, what they would experience are different kinds of agency and then come back to the kinds of segregation that they would experience in the United States. This leads to a global image making, and it becomes diasporic in terms of the connection between people diasporically, whether that's on the African continent, in the Caribbean, or in the United States, and the global image making of criminality and of course of disease that comes out of the Black codes and Jim Crow, certainly in the United States, and then a connection to images of Africa that happened early in the 1900s and then through the civil rights. So we see built-in racism and xenophobia, as was already mentioned, built into centuries and centuries of hard work, and particularly labor laws and also political and social practices. So if we look at the present racial disparities and present day legacies, whether those are educational disparities, housing and zone, banking, employment, incarceration that was already mentioned, it doesn't matter what sphere, but we see these intersectional disparities. And what has happened as a result of these intersectional disparities is we have US Blacks and Hispanics have considerably lower earnings than whites and Asians, over 1.5 times. We know that for all working age Black women, the median wealth, with the contrast between income and wealth, what you earn and then your wealth, is about $100. For Hispanic women, it's $120. And then the wealth gap, when we think about the median wealth, it's $5 for women and Black women and Hispanic women. So what this demonstrates is those legacies of labor and then being able to work in the market continue on until today. And what we see are these differences in ability to work. This has a great impact in terms of thinking about the impact of things like the COVID-19, but also we saw the differential impact in the 1918 flu pandemic, the 1930 depression, and of course in the AIDS pandemic, when we saw the differential impact on Black communities, 69 to 85% morbid mortality rates, and the differential between the flu pandemic and of course in the AIDS and COVID-19. So now what we're seeing, of course, is what people have mentioned, whether it's in St. Louis or Chicago. St. Louis, all but 3 people who died of coronavirus were of African American descent. And while the population is very low in some instances, we see higher death rates. That's the same in Chicago. We see 68% of the death rates are people of African descent. And since we know that there's going to be a panel on healthcare, I'm not going to go into all of the disparities in healthcare, but part of the disparities in the labor market are also related to disparities in healthcare, particularly in the United States, because of the lack of comprehensive healthcare historically. If we think about COVID-19, and again in Louisiana, 70% of the deaths have been, of course, people of African descent. When we think about the image making and the ways in which this is codified historically and in the contemporary moment, we can go back to moments like Katrina. And when I talked about global image making, if we think about these images that have been exported and imported, here we can see there's something where we call the blame and shame. So people of African descent are blamed and shamed for their own disease and of course treated as criminals. On the left-hand side, you can see 2 different descriptions for the same action. In one, a Black person is being described as looting, and then the white couple is described as finding groceries. And this is during Katrina. So the act of thinking about Black people as criminals. And on the right-hand side, you have a mugshot and then a college yearbook shot for 2 different criminals. The man is a rapist, and the woman was accused of neglect for leaving her child next door in a parking lot. Intersections and legacies. The intersections are vast. I don't have time to go through all of this, but particularly in the Americas, as I've already talked about, and particularly in the US, the socioeconomic intersection with Black Americans due to the labor economy and lack of ability to earn has meant that many have borne the brunt of the coronavirus. So when we think of the science of how, why, what, where, and the legacies of racism and xenophobia, what we know today is, and this was already mentioned, that many of people who are of African descent are disproportionately employed in the service industry. So I heard that Maher mentioned this earlier, but if we think about the domestic industry, if we think about transportation, delivery services, I don't know where other people are located, but I'm located right here in New York City in one of the epicenters of the pandemic. And what we know, whether that's visually what we see, but we also know in terms of the markets, that Blacks and Hispanics and Latinos dominate the service industries. And then of course, when we hear about people going home and being infected in their homes and then being blamed for that, what we often hear is that Black and sometimes Hispanics, and of course this has had a differential impact, of course, on Asian and Pacific Islander communities as well, as did the SARS epidemic and others. What we see is that that blame and shame is you're blamed for your own disease or own criminality, when in actuality, there is good science and good research that tells us why people are out, why people are, what they're doing when they're out in terms of thinking about things like the service industry. And that's, of course, global. So, of course, you see here, essential, not expendable, and thinking about redefining this question of what it means to be essential and expendable, and the question of how do we protect workers. We know in the United States, whether it was in grocery stores or other places, they were some of the last people to be protected, to be provided with, whether those were masks, etc. And of course, we know the differential impact for Black men wearing masks here in the United States and the association with criminality. And of course, we've seen that with the most recent incidents, of course, with Floyd and of course, Amy Cooper, for those of you who've been following the news here in the United States. We see the racial legacies in terms of then who gets arrested and who gets killed. We will be hosting a panel. And so one of the things that we say, and I think this links back to what several people were saying, is then how do we deal with these issues? Well, the first is to think, of course, about awareness. And we are hosting our own panel, Essential or Expendable, and we'll be focusing on Latinx workers. Of course, thinking about the crimes against humanity and how we move forward from there. One of the things that I also like to leave with is, what do we do next? So I have two quotes, one from Zora Neale Hurston, one from James Baldwin. Zora Neale Hurston, if you're silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. So we have to, of course, speak about, use the science, use the research to expose the actual facts and the legacies of racism and xenophobia and slavery and the connections back, whether that's, as I said, housing, banking, incarceration rates, and really use that science to demonstrate, right, that we are not silent and we will not continue to be. And also with James Baldwin, of course, the quote there reads, oh, excuse me, sorry, switch to the slide. The world is not as it was when you came in, and it does not when it is as it was when you came in. And so I think that we really have to also think about how we're trying to change what the world is. And so I want to link this quickly to the sustainable goals. And if we think about the sustainable goals for the UN, whether that's good health and sustainable communities, whether that's poverty, whether that's addressing gender inequality, or whether that's addressing partnership goals, I think the question is, how do we be in partnership with Black communities globally now to address these salient issues and actually to address the facts of what is actually occurring, whether that's in the United States, Brazil, France, Canada, wherever this is occurring, and the legacies of slavery. Thank you very much, and I think I have a few minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Coleman, for that excellent presentation. I really like how you brought up intersectional disparities, and you linked it all to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals as well. Interesting as well, talking about the partnerships that the international community can have with Black communities as we move forward. We have around 10 minutes now for questions with Dr. Coleman, so I would encourage you all to type in your questions into the Q&A box. And we'll start with a question from Shahad Elisa. who is asking you, Dr. Coleman, do you believe that there has been a misrepresentation of information on slavery in history curricula in the USA? And how can the educational systems include the history of slavery in an accurate way? And of course, if you could link that all to inclusion and COVID-19, that would be great as well. Over to you, Dr. Coleman.
Yes. So absolutely, the impact of slavery has led to a lot of images. So if we go back even to the Mammy, the Buck, the Jezebel, all of those images of slavery, which were about Black people being shiftless, lazy, criminals, and diseased. And those legacies, of course, there were other communities that were impacted, obviously, by similar kinds of images and historical mapping. So that's exactly right, that then what is recorded is misinformation about Black communities in terms, and this goes back all the way, obviously back to slavery, where slaves were even blamed during Reconstruction for their own enslavement, saying that they wanted to be enslaved. And you could see all of these, the kind of images of the hapless slave who was, without slavery, didn't know what to do, couldn't really work. And that's really the beginning of the things like Black codes. And so if you thinking about inclusion today, as Brendan mentioned, thinking about partnership goals. One of the things that we've just done actually is developed a partnership, for instance, with the University of Pretoria, right? And we're going to think about in that partnership program how to explore different aspects of leadership. I also work with an organization called 360 Leadership here in the United States, where they're looking at Black leadership and really thinking about that legacy and how we sustain Black leadership and teach, right, even outside of Black communities, the relevant histories and the global histories and connections of diaspora. And even if you think about what I mentioned earlier, sometimes when we're focusing on the triangulation of the slave trade, we forget about the other parts of the slave trade that took place across the Indian Ocean. So again, right, making this a full understanding of actually what took place and then the legacies across time. And that would help us understand the impact of something like COVID-19 currently, and the misinformation that is being that is out there and continues, right, to blame Black communities or Latin communities or Asian and Pacific Islander communities for their own deaths, right? When we know that the disparities exist in those healthcare systems and have been systemic and systematic.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Coleman. The next question is from Dr. S. Amare. And they're asking, how is this linked to the experience of African people in China? And I think this is interesting because we have been seeing reports of discrimination in the COVID-19 context in China against people from the African continent. Would you have any insights on that? Or can you draw, since you work on issues of inclusion, can you draw any parallels there?
And I didn't say this when I started. I didn't want to talk too much about myself, but I work globally. And so we actually have a campus in Shanghai. We have a campus in Abu Dhabi. I usually spend, when I'm not sheltering in place, about 65% of my time on the road. So I'm very familiar with the global context. And yes, we have been tracking that as well. And so when I was talking earlier about the global impact of images, right? So when we think about the US, we have those images that I talked about, the hapless slave, et cetera. But the images of Africa are also equally, and this does come out of, to some degree, of the slave moment, is that the early sort of reifying of these images of Africa as a backward place. First of all, Africa as a country, that was the first sort of, right, that it's this blob, that it is one place, and that also, right, that it is backward, and that needs development. So we have all this language about development, right, that has historically then meant that some countries, right, are seen as less than. And so as a result, right, the people also often are seen in those ways. And so what we see is those legacies of racism and xenophobia, right, are transported globally. It's not just like within the US or within Brazil or France where slaves were taken, or Europe. It's actually, right, those images now, of course, are circulated everywhere. And what we know, right, as we're all digitally connected in ways that we never have been. And so when we saw the beginning of the printing press, right, we saw these images circulate around lots of different communities. And of course, now what we see, and even as I was preparing for this presentation, as I typed in various things around Black people, COVID-19, people of Asian descent, people of Latin descent, what I got actually were horrific images about, that were very racist, about people blaming people from various countries. And I would even go even further to say, right, if we go back to the Ebola crisis or the AIDS crisis, what we found was that people tried to blame people in Africa, again, right, for their own criminality and disease, because of those global images that have circulated basically for over 600 years.
Thank you, Dr. Coleman. I paused because there's so many good questions coming in, and unfortunately we don't have time for all of them. So I'm really trying to capture questions that can be grouped together. So this one is kind of interesting. It's from someone named Ton Tay, asking, what training or information would you suggest to help those in the medical community address medical racism, particularly those presenting with symptoms of COVID-19 and not being taken seriously versus their white counterparts?
Yes, okay, so we also know, right, that for people of color, particularly Black people and Black women, when they report pain or disease, they are often, right, seen as not having disease, disproportionate misdiagnoses, whether that's melanoma or COVID-19. So thank you for that question. Yes, training for medical professionals. The AAMC in the United States has great materials you can access. That's the Association of American Medical Colleges. They have great training materials. This is across communities, but also particular for communities of African descent. So does the AMA, the American Medical Association. I cannot say enough. I started this presentation by saying avail yourself of various resources. The Black Medical Association, right, Black medical doctors also has some great materials. So please, please avail yourself of those materials in terms of thinking about trainings. Some medical schools have started this. Before I worked at NYU, and certainly we have some trainings at NYU. I also worked at Harvard University, and Harvard has some programs there. So please also use universities, because universities have lots of training materials online, and you can access those now during the COVID-19 moment. And then specifically what I would say is, let's be, as we are trying to treat people, let's remember that it's about equity. And so whenever someone presents that they are having a problem, let's treat that as if they are having a problem. But thank you very much for the question. And also, if you want links to resources, I put my email up address earlier. It's lisa.coleman@nyu.edu. Please email me and I will send you some resources.
Thank you so much, Dr. Coleman, for that. I think you gave great answers to this selection of questions. We're going to hear from you again at the very, very end. But for now, I'm going to turn over to our second speaker. And our second speaker today is Yoann Lopez. He will be speaking to us from France. Yoann is the project manager in charge of memory, racism, and anti-Semitism for the city of Bordeaux. And Bordeaux is a member of UNESCO's International Coalition of Inclusive and Sustainable Cities. Remember, to ask Yoann a question, just type it in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Yoann, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's okay?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. I apologize in advance for my English. It is horrible. It's a pleasure for me, and I want to thank UNESCO and UNO for this webinar. Second slave port after Nantes, with nearly 500 ships departing from the port of the Moon for the African coasts. Bordeaux was during the 19th century the first colonial port for trade in righteousness. While Nantes began to recognize its dark past from the end of 18th, Bordeaux and the various municipal teams lagged behind to tackle the subject, preferring silence to memorial hubbub, preferring the highlight a wine economy rewarding rather than a dishonorable slave economy. Faced with the surge of demands from local associations wishing to see the city of Bordeaux openly engaged in the recognition of its slave past, it will gradually open up to this new social question: with this essential to more and more strongly of the French national territory from the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 2000s. Three major events participated in this memorial renewal in connection with the slave trade and slavery, both at national and local level. First, a march in 1998, having gathered tens of thousands of descendants of slaves in Paris on the occasion of the 150 years of the abolition of slavery. Secondly, the vote of the law known as Law Taubira, tending to the recognition of the traffic and of slavery as a crime against humanity in 2001. Thirdly, the establishment of the National Day in memory of the slave trade, slavery, and the abolition in 2006. Faced with the pressure from associations and the increasingly pressing need to put the social issues of the memory of the slave trade and slavery on the political agenda, the municipal team, then in activity, opened the door to timid recognition. In 2005, the creation of the Toussaint Louverture Square and the installation of a bust in his effigy and the establishment of a memory commission with the aim of thinking about the visibility of memories and the slave trade and slavery in Bordeaux public space. In 2006, a commemorative plaque was installed on the quays of Bordeaux. On May 10, 2009, 4 rooms dedicated to the slave trade past of the city of Bordeaux were inaugurated at the Musée d'Aquitaine. It will be necessary to wait until 2016 to witness a process of full recognition and visibility of the slave trade and slavery in the public space of Bordeaux, with the establishment of a new memory commission and the adoption in 2018 of a planned memory action. This plan made it possible to fully register the slave trade and slavery in the public space of Bordeaux. The recognition process has brought about renewed social cohesion through the assumed dissemination of a common history and the full inclusion of the history of the victims of trafficking and slavery and their descendants in local history. The memory policy initiated by the city of Bordeaux proceeds from a true policy of inclusion of a history, a memory, a population, combining 3 principles to which 5 tools functions are attached. First of all, a moral principle for which recognition action is essential in terms of fair memory. It is right that the city finally recognizes its role in the slave trade and in terms of appeasement and resolution of potential conflicts related to lack of recognition. A principle of equality, then, for which the socio-historical integration of a community will be achieved via the memory policy carried out. Here, the Afro-Caribbean community is clearly targeted, notably throughout its various associative structures. A principle, in fact, of self-realization, finally, enabled by the memory policy, which will then bring individuals a well-being previously impossible. It is good for me to know that the space in which I live establishes a policy favorable to an inclusive memory. Understandably, the memory policy carried out in Bordeaux for several years in constructive and inclusive both for individuals, including descendants of victims of slavery, communities, and associations. This analytical detour is not in vain to understand the work carried out by the city of Bordeaux for several years on the memory theme. Work which has beneficial consequences in terms of integration in the city, both in terms of the fight against discrimination that the cancellation of marginalization of the population potentially weakened by a real or supposed foreign origin. These benefits were almost naturally found during the health crisis caused by COVID-19. Bordeaux is one of the major French cities which has the least problem of racism and ethno-racial discrimination, and the areas identified as suburbs experience less urban violence than other French suburbs located in cities like Toulouse, Marseille, or Saint-Denis. This is not to say that the fact of racism and spatial segregation don't exist, but to a lesser extent than in other French cities. Thus, there was no overexposure and exposures and excess mortality of Afro-Caribbean population on COVID-19 on Bordeaux territory. However, there is a bias against this observation, since France prohibits any use of ethnic statistics, unlike the United States and the United Kingdom. Therefore, an ethnic record of population contaminated with COVID-19 is not possible. In short, a parallel with the US context, where it has been observed that African Americans are more affected by COVID-19 is not possible. In addition to a local context of relative social peace, of good integration into the urban landscape of the city help in this by an important associative network relay of these populations with the municipal team. The national context offers insurance-free sickness for all without any distinctions, ensures the descending population of slaves the same access to care, thereby limiting greater fragility in face of COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yoann, for that. I think it's very interesting when you were talking about Bordeaux having a very being the least problematic when it comes to racism amongst French cities, but then at the same time, France does not keep ethnic statistics, so it can be hard to measure that. But I also take note that when you were talking about equal access of many different people to healthcare. So it's interesting. I have a question here from Shahad Elisa asking, what are some ways of increasing access to healthcare that you have seen implemented in Bordeaux?
So Linda or Garance?
Yes, I'm here. Donc la question, c'est quelles seraient les manières que vous aviez d'améliorer l'accès aux soins de santé et que vous avez mis en œuvre à Bordeaux?
La principale action qui a été mise en place à Bordeaux a été notamment la distribution de masques pour toute la population.
So the main initiative that was implemented in Bordeaux was the distribution of masks.
Yes. Donc il y avait 2 masques distribués par foyer sur toute la population bordelaise et aussi métropolitaine.
So 2 masks were distributed per household within the municipality, and vous avez dit toute la municipalité, c'est ça?
Oui, tout à fait. Voilà, c'est l'une des actions. Ensuite, concernant l'accès des soins à la santé, c'est idem à ce qui se fait en France. Hein. L'accès à la santé est gratuit pour tous. Donc sur ça, c'est vrai que c'est un avantage considérable en France par rapport à ce qui se fait ailleurs, notamment.
One of the main advantages of the situation in France is that healthcare is accessible and free for all. So that is one of the main advantages in France.
Thank you. Now, I have another question from Alan McFarlane, which is interesting as well. It's about the Sustainable Development Goals. Yoann, in this context of COVID-19, how in Bordeaux are you using and operationalizing the Sustainable Development Goals?
Donc la question se porte sur les objectifs du développement durable. les ODD des Nations Unies, et comment est-ce que vous utilisez ces objectifs du développement durable à Bordeaux dans vos actions?
Alors c'est une bonne question. Sur les objectifs du développement durable, en lien avec le Covid, très honnêtement, il n'y a pas de lien évident sur cette question-là. Quel est la pensée qui est derrière cette question entre le développement durable et Covid? Je saisis pas très bien.
So this is actually a very interesting question to link the SDGs with COVID-19. To be honest, there doesn't seem to be an obvious link. And Mr. Lopez was interesting in knowing which would be the thinking behind this question, the thinking behind putting together SDGs in COVID-19.
Well, I think one of the things that is special about these UNESCO webinars is that they bring policymakers together with experts and the general public. And I think maybe that's something, Yoann, that you can take back to the mayor's office in Bordeaux, to think about how to build that link between the Sustainable Development Goals and the fight against COVID-19, because there's some very, very clear links there when it comes to protecting the health of our world's population. But I have another question for you, the last question for you, Yoann, from Camila Yanez. And she's asking, she's drawing a comparison, and she's saying, given the inequalities that have excluded populations like African Americans, could this also be equally valid for other excluded populations, such as refugees from the Middle East in Europe? Have they been included in the healthcare system? Maybe you can tell us what you're seeing in Bordeaux about that.
Du coup, ce que disait Monsieur Varma, c'est que c'est vrai que ce qui est intéressant avec les webinaires de l'UNESCO, c'est qu'on réunit ensemble les experts et le public et les décideurs politiques. Et c'est vrai que ça peut être quelque chose d'intéressant à rapporter à la mairie de Bordeaux, de réfléchir justement à ce lien entre l'accès de tous aux soins de santé, aux objectifs du développement durable et à la manière dont on a de répondre au Covid-19. Et M. Varma vous pose une dernière question qui est posée par Camila Yanez. Étant donné les inégalités que subissent les populations exclues, comme par exemple les Africains américains dans la crise, est-ce que vous pensez que cette analyse peut aussi être valide pour les autres populations exclues, comme par exemple les réfugiés du Moyen-Orient en Europe?
Oui, tout à fait. Alors sur Bordeaux, encore une fois, cela c'est pas avéré, parce que il y a effectivement une assez bonne intégration, comme je le disais, des populations, notamment les plus fragiles. Alors pas forcément des populations afro-antillaises, hein, mais des populations les plus fragiles, assez bonne intégration avec un relais des associations très importantes. Je vous laisse traduire un petit peu. Je finirai après.
Oui, merci. So yes, absolutely, said Mr. Lopez. In Bordeaux, as you said earlier, there's a good integration of refugees and migrants, but especially for the most vulnerable. Je vous laisse poursuivre.
Oui. À Bordeaux, la population migrante, notamment syrienne, a été faible. Toutefois, comme toute population fragile, à l'image de la population afro-américaine aux États-Unis, toutes les populations fragiles à risque sont effectivement des populations plus vulnérables. Pourquoi? Parce que soit amenées à vivre dans la rue de manière permanente ou durable, soit parce que ces populations sont amenées à occuper des emplois qui ne permettent pas notamment le télétravail, par exemple, et donc obligent à être sur place et être en contact physique.
So the thing is, the most vulnerable, because of the situation, remain vulnerable in face of the COVID-19. I'm adding a few of my words here with my notes. The thing is that with some Syrian refugees or other vulnerable populations, they might be homeless permanently or for a short time, and because of that situation they are more vulnerable to the COVID-19. There's also the issue of their work. They might be working in a job that does not allow them to telework and work from home, and as a consequence they are also more vulnerable to the virus.
Je terminerai comme réponse que voilà, pour ces populations fragiles et notamment migrantes, récemment migrantes, comme les populations voilà, fragiles sur le territoire bordelais, c'est l'accès à la santé aussi qui est très important. Alors en France, on a un système de santé qui est plutôt, voilà, qui est plutôt bon, et il a encore prouvé récemment avec le Covid-19, mais notamment pour les populations migrantes, notamment syriennes, qui n'ont pas forcément une connaissance de notre système de santé. Il est important, voilà, qu'elles soient informées, et notamment via les associations qui vont faire le relais et les informer qu'il y a effectivement un système de santé accueillant en France, notamment sur Bordeaux, afin que celle-ci soit prise en charge le plus rapidement possible et le mieux possible, afin voilà, de à la fois limiter la contagion et de limiter la mortalité au sein de ces populations.
And so to finally answer the last question, for those most vulnerable population, including Syrian refugees and migrants, it should be noted that even if the access to healthcare in France is quite good, it's also very important for those refugees and migrants who might not know how it works, that they have information. So information is key, and this is why civil society organizations are doing most of the work and faire le relais, I'm trying to find the word, but they are the ones welcoming the refugees and migrants and informing them and telling them what their rights are with regards to healthcare, to access to healthcare. And this is what also helps stop the spreading of the disease and also stop the mortality rates.
Thank you so much, Garance, and thank you, Yoann.
Thank you, Garance, for this translation.
Thank you. Apologies for a few mistakes.
My UNESCO colleagues are just asking me to add that Bordeaux has been a good example of showing integration. It's been a long-standing policy there, and that national and local policies favor inclusive memory. Also with the universal health care, that has been a plus factor. So all of that relates to COVID-19 and inclusion, and it should be seen as a positive example. So thank you, Yoann. We are now going to move on to our third expert, María Elisa Velázquez. She'll be speaking to us from Mexico City. She's an anthropologist who has written extensively on communities of African descent in Latin America. And she's also a former president of the UNESCO Slave Route Project's International Scientific Committee. We look forward to your questions, and Dr. Velázquez, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Brendan. Well, first of all, I want to thank all the team of UNESCO for this kind invitation, especially to Linda Tinio and Dorian Romans. It's very nice to hear that the Slave Route Project still is working, and it's doing a very good job to spread the word about the slave trade and the consequence. Well, I am going to read my paper, and I will try to be very clear. Unfortunately, slavery legacies continue to have consequence for the millions of African people and their descendants that were brought by force to different parts of the world through land and sea roads, just like Linda Coleman reminds us. These are clearly expressed during economic, social, political, and health crises like the one we are living now. These consequences are not being faced only by Afro-descendants from America and other different parts of the world, but rather by societies along the African continent, still enduring colonial and economic exploitation practice derived from the history of slavery. The enormous disparities that are present in most societies, the historic discrimination that are experienced by Afro-descendants populations stemming from historic and contemporary migrations, the prejudice, stereotypes, and racist manifestations that we see and hear daily in social networks and international mainstream media, racist ideologies. It is important to remember that the notion of race and racism were developed during the 18th century to justify exploitation, submission, and oppression brought upon some human beings by other human beings. In this presentation, I will reflect racism issues toward Afro-descendants that have become more visible since the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic. I will also make some observations on the impact on the public policy, research projects, community support, and other strategies and activities direct towards Afro-descendant population. It is important to stress, as we hear before, that the pandemic spreads exactly during the epicenter of the international decade for people of African descent 2015-2024, proclaimed by the United Nations and created precisely to promote actions, efforts, policies, and plans towards the recognition, justice, and development of Afro-descendants. The economic crisis released by this health emergency has as well have drastic impacts on the goal of this decade. A first reflection that stands out since the increase of the COVID-19 pandemic is a constant reference to the notion of race attached to health problems and disease. It had been demonstrated scientifically, and it has been explained over and over that races do not exist. They are a social and pseudosciences invention to justify the human trait and the exploitation and submission of certain human beings by others, precisely during the peak period of African people trade. Nonetheless, this notion continues to be used by many societies, especially by mainstream media and social networks, but even so by academia and in medical instance to differentiate among social, cultural, economic, and religious groups. For example, since the emergency of COVID in China, as you were talking about 1 minute ago, racist expressions and comments started surfacing against people of Asian descent, especially against Chinese people. In social networks, in national and international newscasts, during the first days of the epidemic, we read and hear comments related to Chinese people's responsibility for the epidemic given their gastronomy, their traditions, and customs. In this respect, it is important to note how the notion of race regains its 19th century meanings during crises like the one we are living. Meanings that tightly link biological characteristics of people to cultural ones. In other words, it's not only about certain groups having certain particularities given by the color of the skin, their features of their hair type, but also because of their history, their culture, the ways of thinking and organizing. Paradoxically, within the same days, according to French newscast, as you were explaining, in Chinese, they were racist manifestations against African people. They say African people were in bars and local, were not allowed entrance, and were even ousted from their houses, forced to live on the streets. How it is possible that such experience of racism occur between cultures that have faced similar discriminations themselves? Similarly, the concept of race continued to resonate in the development of the pandemic connected with Afro-descendants. News in the United States have confirmed that more people of the Afro-American race die from the virus without explaining, as Elisa was talking about, the social and economic conditions of this mortality, and more so reproducing the idea of different human races. It is known fact that Afro-descendants populations in most countries in America live under marginalized conditions, poverty, or means than other groups. But in addition, given the harmful element in the diet to sustain, they experience health problems and disease such as obesity, diabetes, or high blood pressure. Very little has been mentioned on these social networks and new caste, and the same with the empowering economic conditions that Afro-descendant population endure, mainly in Latin America and the Caribbean. Also, although figures of Afro-descendants sick or dead due to COVID-19 remain difficult to calculate in our countries, it had been said that many Afro-descendant communities do not have the health infrastructure to tend to the sick. Amongst them, as we have been seeing, the populations in Colombian Pacific, Guayaquil in Ecuador, and within the favelas in Brazil. In this sense, it is regrettable that the notion of race as a legacy of slavery peak continues to serve to classify human beings, but more so to relate them to certain physical and cultural characteristics with propensity to disease development without consideration of economic and social contexts that are ultimately the factors that determine how the pandemic is being experienced. It is true that most human beings are exposed to disease, and in this respect, COVID-19 does not discriminate. However, its complication depends on factors such as age, state of health, the possibility or not to stay at home, but also, very importantly, on the access to medical attention available across the community, regions, and countries in America, in Latin America, and the Caribbean. In Mexico, historic Afro-descendant populations that are descendants of the migration, the forced migration of African people, and that arrived during the colonial period, are placed in various regions of the territory, mainly in the area known as Costa Chica in the states of Guerrero and Oaxaca, and in the Pacific Ocean coastline, but also in the state of Veracruz on the Atlantic shores. According to the first census done in 2015, about 1.5 million Mexicans recognize themselves as Afro-descendants. The COVID-19 pandemic has affected mentioned before, many of them live in places stricken by poverty and exclusion without access to medical care. The figures so far reported in these Afro-descendant territories are not alarming, but the progress of the epidemic in these regions is still unclear. In the other sides, regarding contemporary African and Afro-descendants in Mexico, I mean recent immigration, are facing great levels of discrimination and racism during the pandemic. For several years ago, African immigration to Mexico borders has increased. They come from 35 different countries of Africa, but also from Central American countries and also Haiti and Cuba. It is estimated that around 10,000 Africans and Afro-descendants live in precarious and complicated conditions in Mexican border areas, besides facing the risk brought by COVID-19. And they have also suffered a lot of racism and discrimination in these places. The economic, social, and cultural issues on this pandemic are not only expressed in everyday practice of discrimination and racism, but also in public policy, action, and programming in favor of Afro-descendant populations, especially, as it had been mentioned before, in the context of the Decade for People of African Descent. many Latin American and Caribbean countries have seen advancement in the recognition of these populations and the drafting of public policy to assert their rights. For example, last year, Mexico finally recognized Afro-descendant people, communities, and populations in its federal constitution, and at last, after a long struggle process of African organization and scholar interest in the subject, a question of self-affiliation for Afro-Mexican and Afro-descendants was included in the National Population and Housing Census 2020. However, the COVID-19 pandemic arrived in Mexico when the census was not complete, and we ignored the consequence on disregarding the counting of Afro-descendant populations. Moreover, the budgets for Afro-descendant populations attention programs has been greatly affected in Latin American countries. On the 28th of April of this year, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights called to the states in the region to guarantee the prompt access to public health service through prevention, mitigation, and treatment measures in the context of COVID-19, assuring equal status and without discrimination. In addition, the 7th of April, the United Nations Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent urged the governments to commit themselves to equality in the rendering of health service to Afro-descendants people during the COVID-19 crisis. Nevertheless, it will be a big challenge for governments to find the resources that will allow the accomplishment of these commitments. We are facing unique challenge with a pandemic that generates incertitude, which call into question the world economic models and the insufficient and privatized health service. It had been revealed that in the crisis, we cannot seek protection through borders or walls, like certain nations are thinking about. In this sense, discrimination and racism as results of historic process like the slavery of millions of people from the African continent cannot continue to avail the drawing of distinctions between human beings. It is urgent to promote strategies to devote the homogeneity of the humans and at the same time highlight the cultural difference that enrich and fraternize us. We are facing, and with this I am finishing, important challenge for Afro-descendants communities in the middle of the decade, and we'll still have a lot more to do despite the pandemic. States and societies, we must put the effort needed to grant budgets and attention to the Afro-descendants communities. Likewise, it is a priority to fight against discrimination and racism. Only in this way we shall build equal and democratic societies that are respectful of others and their environment, but most of all, that show solidarity in the face of adversities. Thank you very much. I wait for the questions.
Thank you so much, Maria Elisa, for that great presentation, and for also just highlighting the situation of Mexicans of African descent. It's interesting because you spoke about how race doesn't really exist. It's a pseudoscientific invention, and yet you've shown it clearly is attached to our health and diagnoses. So that's a really important point that you brought up. You touched on this a bit, but I have a question here from Lamine Jarjou, who's saying, what would you suggest as a solution to racism in the world? Now that's a very big question, and you have kind of touched on some steps, but I'm wondering if you could expand on that for Lamine. What would you suggest as a solution to racism?
I think we have a lot of things to do, but the main thing is knowledge. And that's why I appreciate so much the work of UNESCO and the work of the Slave Root Project. We have to break the episodes of history that doesn't help us to understand what we are doing and that we are the same kind of humans. So I think the knowledge that we have to spread in the schools, in the museums, also that's what I appreciate very much, the work that Bordeaux is doing. We need more museums. In Mexico, we don't have museums that speak about this. We don't have in the scholar curriculum the story of the slaves that came to Mexico. Most of the Mexicans don't know about the African heritage that we have and the presence of a lot of Afro-descendants communities in our countries. So I think to fight against racism, we need knowledge. And we also need campaigns to explain that we are the same. Not only it's about image, but also to destroy this concept of racism and not racism, the race problem that, as you were saying, we use a lot to say that one person is different from the other. We have to find another way to explain this.
Thank you, María Elisa. I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to give it to Eva Kaufman. She's asking about what kinds of initiatives can we take to model resilience, adaptation, and renewal of local economies in the face of COVID-19?
Yes, that's the main question. I really appreciate it. I think and I hope that after this pandemic, the governments and the societies think about the way we are living, think about the way we are destroying environment. So I think that also have to deal with the capitalism models that we are reproducing. We have to find another ways of economic development that it's in equal vision with environment. We cannot destroy our environment and also our people. You know, in Latin America, especially in Mexico, we have a lot of business of minería, minery, and that destroy the environment and the communities organization, and we have to think about it. And so it's a very difficult goal, but as societies, we have to press our governments to make a change on our economic models.
Thank you so much, María Elisa. We're going to come back to you at the very end, but right now we're going to go to our fourth and final expert, and that is Webster. Webster is a Canadian hip-hop artist and lecturer. He's originally from Quebec City and currently based in Montreal. To ask Webster a question, just type it into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Webster, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It is an honor for me to be amongst you to discuss such an important matter. So my name is Ndiaye, aka Webster, hip-hop artist from Quebec City. And I'm really interested about history, mostly about slavery in Canada and Quebec, as well as the presence of people of African descent here since the start of New France. A lot of people, even in Canada, don't know that there was slavery here. Indigenous slavery and Black slavery for about 200 years. The first African slave to arrive here arrived in Quebec City in 1629. He was from Madagascar. Since many of you have spoken about what's going on today with the coronavirus and people of African descent, I wanted to go back in time to talk about the link between the idea of race, racism, and diseases. So during the scientific revolution of the 18th century, scientists started to categorize everything from plants to animals to men. And as you might know, the Swedish botanist Carl von Linné divided the human species in 4 groups: American, native, European, Asiatic, and African. Each with its physiognomical and cultural traits. And in his seminal work, The System of Nature, published in 1735, he wrote that the American was governed by his customs, the European by laws, the Asiatic by opinions, and the African by the arbitrary will of his master. So slavery in the Atlantic world then became the perfect setting to give credence to these race theories. In the Americas, 3 out of 4 of those categories were daily interacting with each other in a very strict societal frame concerning race. So you had white people as masters, black people being enslaved, and the First Nations being enslaved, killed, or expelled from their land. So the setting therefore contributed to the perceived inferiority or superiority, for that matter, of such or such race. This warped reality in the Atlantic world during slavery was the perfect breeding ground to embody those new theories and test them scientifically, or more appropriately, as said Madame Velázquez, pseudo-scientifically. So in the US at the eve of the Civil War in the 1850s, the Virginian doctor Samuel A. Cartwright was blending race theories and pseudoscience as to prove scientifically the differences between whites and blacks. So for instance, he described the black people as having knees more flexed or bent than any other kind of man. It was therefore God's will for them to be submissive knee benders, as he called them. He wrote in the New Orleans Medical and Surgical Journal in 1851 about 2 diseases peculiar to the Negro race. The first one was drapetomania, was the propensity for slaves to run away. So they weren't even perceived as human beings trying to escape bondage. They were seen as slaves with a mental disease because they wanted to be free. There's another disease described as the dysesthesia Aethiopis, which caused slaves to be lazy, to break, waste, and destroy everything they handled. So this is where almost 200 years later that it relates to today, because one of the symptoms of dysesthesia Aethiopis was an insensitivity to pain. A myth that still exists to this day in certain medical circles, and Dr. Coleman spoke a bit about it. There was a research article published in the Pain Management Journal in 2012 that stated that Black patients in the US were less likely to be given pain medications, and if given, would receive lower quantities because they were perceived as feeling less pain by white medical staffs. And they did the same research in Canada the same year with the same results. And by the way, the remedies suggested by Samuel Cartwright to cure these 2 diseases range from whipping to hard labor and fresh air. So today, when some people talk about drinking disinfectant or shine UV light in the body to fight the coronavirus, kind of dwell in the same scientific waters here. So also the Cartwright, the famous physician, thought that there was a 20% deficiency in Black people's lung capacities compared to whites. And to this day, the instrument designed to test this capacity, the spirometer, still has a race correction built in the software to this day. So we see that races and the way those diseases were applied to this, the idea of race still has an impact today in the medical circles. The legacy of colonization and slavery remains through structural racism, ou le racisme systémique en français. Either it is for people of African descent, racialized people, or First Nation people. The idea of race fostered social inequities that now have a real biological impact. As the saying goes, it is not races that came before racism, but racism that constructed the idea of race. Racism preceded and bred the idea of race. Data in the US, UK, and Brazil show clearly that many more Black people and racialized people are impacted by the coronavirus, whether it is because of the type of jobs, areas of housing, or lack of health services. Also, we may talk a bit about weathering or health deterioration due to discrimination and stress. as developed by Arlene Geronimus about 15 years ago. So this weathering could also come into play as a risk factor. So in other words, the body's response to external stressful experiences such as racism and discrimination leaves an impact upon the health, which in turn could influence the way it fights the virus when infected. So no confinement, working from home, and social distancing remain privileges that not everybody can afford. And this is where structural racism comes into play. And there's no data in Canada yet concerning the impact of COVID-19 amongst people of color, although many people on social justice advocates are asking for them. Montreal is at the epicenter of the crisis in Canada. It has 5% of the Canadian population, but with 28% of its coronavirus cases and 39% of the number of deaths. The most hit neighborhood in the city is called Montréal Nord, North Montreal. And it is one of the poorest neighborhood in the country. And I guessed it, one of the most diverse, with half of its residents being racialized and 42% of its residents being immigrants. On that matter, many migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers now work by the hundreds as healthcare workers in Quebec. And 1 in 5, about 23% get infected. Earlier this month, the Quebec government was asked to recognize their contribution and to help regularize their status, but it refused to do so because they didn't want to encourage others to irregularly cross the border from the US, a border which is closed at the moment. And this government is notorious for its aggressive stance against immigration. And as Montréal Nord's activist and community organizer Will Prosper said, it's these people who are still taking care of us when not too long ago, they were the people who wanted to kick out. So to conclude, I think it is important to highlight structural racism originating from slavery as the origin of economic inequalities, which in turn put at risk people of African descent in the Western world. And as Merlin Chokwanyon wrote in the New England Journal of Medicine 3 weeks ago, doing so will prevent COVID-19 from being perceived as a minority problem linked to the unsubstantiated racial biology or racialized characterization of behavior. So, and Madame Velázquez talked about it. More people of African descent being infected by this pandemic does not pertain to physical or cultural differences, but to a system that fed inequalities based on the color line for centuries. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Webster, for that very interesting presentation. I mean, you drew very clear links between slavery, racism, and health. You also spoke about the myths surrounding the bodies of people of African descent. You know, when COVID-19 first arose as a pandemic, there were a lot of myths that people of African descent couldn't even get COVID-19. There's a lot of misunderstanding, misconceptions out there. You touched on all of that, and it was actually very interesting to hear about how this is playing out in Canada and specifically in Montreal as well. So thank you very much. For the first question, Webster, it's coming from Sababu Shabaka, who's saying that the enslavement of Africans was socioeconomic, resulting in the destruction of families, societies, and kingdoms. Wouldn't a correction to today's racism require some degree of restoration of what was destroyed?
I think so. I think restoration, we might think about art, we might think about money, economies. We think also about history, because slavery stripped the African people from their history. So when we go to school, to colleges, universities, the history that is taught is European history from a European standpoint. So Africans have been robbed from their place in world's history. So we need to go back to that knowledge. Madame Velázquez talked about it. We need to go back to that knowledge to be able to fight racism and see that Africans and people of African descent are part of this history. And it's not only an anecdote, and it's not only, it doesn't only pertain to slavery. We need to go back to the history of those empires, of those people who resisted slavery, to be able to have a broader picture. I think that since maybe the last 100 years, we talked about slavery had an important role to shape what's going on. Slavery shaped what's going on today in the world. And we need to think as the world as a whole and not only as Western oriented.
Thank you, Webster. And I have another question here about, since you are a hip hop artist, how can art, music, hip hop, and social media play a role in promoting racial justice?
Well, to me, art is a way to convey messages that are not always able to reach everybody. It is the way to talk about things when people are not always interested to study or read about it. So for example, I started to be interested about the history of slavery here when nobody talked about it. And that was something that was unknown. So I started to rap about this history. And now people were more aware, people who couldn't read those books because they weren't interested in reading, but they weren't interested in knowing. So I was able to translate that history into music so that people could still hear and learn about those information. So we could democratize knowledge. Recently, I put together an exhibit at the Museum of Fine Arts of Quebec about runaway slaves, because I wanted people to know about the slaves here and also how they resisted to slavery. So I took the ads in the newspapers where they are described, and I had them drawn so they were able to face them and see what was going on 200 years ago.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Webster. There are actually so many great questions coming in, and I'm really sad I can't get to all of them, but we are nearing the end of today's webinar. We would love to hear your thoughts on how it has gone so that we can continue improving. So in the chat box to the right of your screen, you will see a link to a very short survey. If you could take that survey immediately after this webinar, we would be very grateful. Before we turn now to the closing remarks from UNESCO, I would like to ask all of our 4 expert panelists for one final word. Specifically, what would you like the audience to take away from today's discussion? So we're just going to go through all 4 panelists one at a time, and we're going to start with Dr. Coleman. Dr. Coleman, what's the final takeaway that people should take away?
Well, thank you to the other panelists. Awareness and education, hope and resiliency, right? And let's get the science and research correct so we can combat these images and misinformation.
Excellent, excellent points. Thank you, Dr. Coleman. Yoann, any last words from you?
Yes, it's ce sera possible de traduire, s'il vous plaît.
Oui,
Garance, over to you.
Thank you. Un dernier point. Tout d'abord, merci pour ce webinaire très important. Important parce que il permet de faire le lien entre une question actuelle qu'est le Covid-19 et sanitaire, et entre une question actuelle et une question et le passé, qu'est l'esclavage et la traite négrière et sa mémoire, son histoire qui est rattachée au présent et qui reste une question voilà, très présente. Je vous laisse continuer, Garance, je continuerai après.
Merci. So first of all, thank you for this very important webinar, which makes the connection, the link between a very current question, which is the COVID-19 pandemic, and a much older question, the the slave trade and slavery and memory and remembering of it.
Et cette crise du Covid-19 montre à quel point voilà, les erreurs du passé, les crimes du passé peuvent avoir des conséquences fortes sur le présent et sur certaines populations du présent actuel.
And mistakes and crimes from our past have a very important impact and many consequences on our lives today.
Et voilà, ce qui concerne du coup la ville de Bordeaux, voilà, celle-ci reste à la fois très engagée donc sur cette question de mémoire de l'esclavage, puisqu'on va essayer d'avoir notamment le label de l'UNESCO de la route de l'esclave. Et voilà, Bordeaux, la ville de Bordeaux est très engagée sur cette question, comme elle est engagée effectivement sur la lutte contre le racisme et contre les discriminations.
And so this is a very important question for the city of Bordeaux, because the city is highly committed to fighting racism and discrimination and to promoting remembering the memory of slavery, including by requesting UNESCO's label the slave route that they're hoping to receive.
Et pour terminer, oui, Bordeaux reste engagé, voilà, est très fortement engagé dans la lutte contre le racisme et les discriminations, dans un objectif effectivement de pouvoir valoriser toujours une meilleure cohésion sociale et un vivre ensemble important. Et le travail qui a été notamment mené contre le Covid-19 a été aussi un travail de promotion pour favoriser le vivre ensemble et la cohésion sociale. Merci.
And so, excusez-moi. And so to end, the city of Bordeaux is highly committed to fighting racism and discrimination, also mostly to promote and highlight the importance of living together and of social cohesion, because fighting against the COVID-19 pandemic is also about this. It's also about promoting living together in peace.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Yoann, and thank you, Garance, for interpreting. María, Elisa, the floor is yours for a last word.
Yes, only to say how it's important to talk about history to understand our present. And if we don't know about the history of the slave trade and the consequence of this history, we cannot understand what is happening now. And the importance to talk about it, to do museums, to explain to the people, and to fight against racism in this crisis like the pandemic of COVID-19 that we are living. Thank you very much for UNESCO, and again, thank you for having this important slave route project.
Thank you, María, Elisa. And over to you, Webster, for a final word.
I'll go along the lines of my colleagues. I think that a lot of people dismiss slavery as a thing of the past, still exists today, and the impact of the transatlantic slave trade, we still live with this impact. And a crime of this magnitude cannot go away in a couple decades of emancipation, you know, because there's a lot of residuals. We'll talk about structural racism today. So I think that we need to remember that history, talk about it, and go forward and dismantle racism that sprang forth ignorance.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our four panelists. I think everyone really appreciated all of your insights and expertise on this very important topic. And just our very final speaker will be Angela Mello, the Director of Policies and Programs in UNESCO's Social and Human Sciences sector. She will be delivering these closing remarks from Paris. Angela, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brendan. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. A very good afternoon to all of you, each and all of you. from Paris, and distinguished speakers, Dr. Elisa, Coleman, Mrs. Yoann Lopez, Ms. Velázquez, and Webster. Thank you so much for having you with us today and for your excellent contributions to this focused theme on confronting slavery's legacy of racism together. We have today a rich conversation, rich thoughts, but a COVID-19 pandemic has undoubtedly shown us and exposed previous legacies, including racism, discrimination, inequalities, and vulnerabilities of people of African descent in many societies. It is evident that the crisis has aggravated the systemic inequalities and discriminations that have been existing before the outbreak. The disproportionate illness and death among people of African descent in many parts of the world demonstrate the repercussions of structural racism. We are always hear this word, structural racism. This is very important to retain in our minds and bring to the fore the racial haunts that still persist until today. We understand that there is a connection between structural racism, structural inequalities, and economy. Our role as a human beings, communities, and public authorities and institutions is not to stay silent, as one of you told us what to do. I think actually all of you, as we are facing the challenges of pandemic, but we cannot continue in silence. The stories that we have heard today from distinguished speakers, on the contrary, inspires us to galvanize our efforts in upholding the fundamental human rights for all, inclusive policymakers approaches that will bring all multi-stakeholders around the consultation table should be reinforced to ensure that measures taken to address crisis likewise includes the voices of vulnerable communities themselves. This is really very important. And this is also a matter of ethical issue. Working with academia, some of you are, civil society, NGOs, city officials can foster a wall of community approach. Working with the city officials who are the COVID-19 front lines to ensure that policy responses to the pandemic remain effective, inclusive, embedded in ethical principles and dimensions. This is also another point that we are keen on it. We are the advisory body that working on ethical dimensions to be embedded in the public policies. This will not happen overnight. This transformation requires a change mindsets. I think Dr. Coleman and Velázquez were told about education, knowledge. This is what UNESCO tried to do and deliver to the societies. Collective efforts, work, monitoring, evaluation of public policies, reviewing, and work together. Change mindset is back and forth, but we have to move together. It requires also political will, resources, effective local and national government public policies initiatives, feeding the international platforms and frameworks. But it's important to understand the root causes of racism and discrimination through a careful analysis of historical, political, social, and economic contexts and process. This requires a permanent review and strategies, adequate strategies and policies and practices as well, in collaboration with all our multi-stakeholders. Cities are essential actors for positive change, for dialogue and for inclusion. This is also recognized by the SDGs and targets. And cities need support from political policymakers, political support, and also resources. Bordeaux, for example, is an example, but without political support, resource, and so on, you can do nothing. And also, we are encouraging city-to-city cooperation. And through our UNESCO International Coalition of Inclusive and Sustainable Cities, this is a key channel for delivering our program policies on social inclusion, protecting vulnerable peoples, indigenous peoples, etc. So really, I count very much with the ICCAR and also you from now on, and also dear virtual participants. As you said, Ms. Velázquez, knowledge. Knowledge is important, knowledge is the power. We have to share knowledge. We have to democratize knowledge. And this requires, of course, academic thoughts and work, civil society, because you have a scientific knowledge, but we have also science citizen knowledge. So that let's bring together all this knowledge in order to change the realities, change the world. We need also shared governance, global governance. We need global solidarity. Deconstructing racism is another crucial aspect in combating the discrimination and inequalities towards people of African descent. I appreciate very much your phrase, Webster. You say that the racism was constructed the idea of race. This is for something that I will put on my mind and try to really understand, because it's really very, very, also for young people to be stimulated and go to the analysis and scientific knowledge on the root causes of racism. So as I said, we have to work with the academics, civil society, etc. And also another thing we should also put in mind is we cannot have these elitist views. We have thinkers, but we have also voices of women, voices of vulnerable people, voices of poor people as the intellectual richness, and including people who are suffering from the racism and people people of African descent as well. So everyone has a say, something to say and to put in the and reconstruct our societies. The conscious and unconscious prejudices that we developed, whether as individual or groups, tend to value those who resembled us and devalue those who differ from us. Once this notion of differences is prioritized and essentialized, then it leads to racist attitudes and behaviors. And this is what we strive from in the UNESCO masterclass series against racism and discriminations. I think you are aware about these master classes. We are very, very keen on delivering these kind of classes to deconstruct these prejudices. This is also echoed by UNESCO's Slave Roots project that emphasizes the ethical requirements and promotes a scientific and unbiased approach in order to reconcile historical research with the due to remember. I would like to remember that this webinar was conceived within the framework of the International Decade for the People of African Descent, 2015-2024. And I'd like also to recall you the objectives of this decade is to give due recognition to the significant contributions made by peoples of African descent to our societies. I think Webster, you talk on it, to establish concrete measures to enhance their full inclusion therein, as well as to fight racism and discrimination in all its forms. There are some progress, but you have to do more. So for concluding, thank you so much for joining us on this special edition of International Webinar series that the social human science sector is building on. And also we are honored to have organized with this webinar in collaboration with the United Nations Department of Global Communication in New York and its Remember Slavery program. A big thanks to Maher Nasser, Director of Outreach Division, and to Brendan Varma. We can become key partners, and our moderator today and their teams for making this webinar possible. I'd like to invite you to attend the next webinars, which are, for example, will hold during the June month, and also in the items like rights to indigenous peoples, youth initiatives, persons with disabilities, among others, and also invite the city authorities and experts around the world to come. As a director, I'm very satisfied with my team because I'm receiving several congratulations from the civil society. So thank you so much for all of you, and be safe, and see you next time.
Thank you so much, Angela. Thank you, Angela. And thank you to Lisa, María, Elisa, Yoann, and Webster. And that concludes our webinar for today. I'd like to thank you all for tuning in, and I hope that you've been able to gain some new insights or knowledge that will help us all to promote inclusion in the time of COVID-19 and to confront slavery's legacy of racism together. Thank you
very much.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, bye bye.
Have a great day, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.